The great hall fell silent as the golden chalice struck the marble floor. Wine, red as blood, spread across the pristine stones while hundreds of nobles froze in their seats. The bride, barely 16, stood trembling in her wedding gown, tears cutting tracks through her powder-white cheeks. Above her, on the dais, the king's voice boomed with cruel satisfaction. "Let this be a lesson to all who dare question my authority," he declared, his words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Not even my queen is above my judgment." The wedding feast had turned into a public execution of dignity. What should have been the most glorious day of a young woman's life became a spectacle of humiliation that would echo through the corridors of power for generations. This wasn't just royal cruelty. This was calculated destruction, designed to break not just a bride, but the very concept of defiance itself. Welcome to Scandalous Pasts, where we uncover the darkest secrets hidden behind golden crowns and silk curtains. Today, we're diving into one of history's most shocking displays of royal brutality. A wedding that became a weapon, a celebration that turned into psychological warfare, and a king whose need for control knew no bounds. Before we begin this descent into the shadows of absolute power, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our journeys into history's most scandalous moments. Now, let's step back in time to witness how love became leverage, and marriage became a battlefield. Hashtag the arrangement of ambition. The story begins not with romance, but with politics wrapped in silk ribbons. King Aldric the Merciless, ruler of the fictional kingdom of Valdoria, was a man who viewed everything through the lens of power. At 35, he had already crushed 3 rebellions, executed dozens of nobles, and earned a reputation that made neighboring kingdoms tremble at the mention of his name. But Aldric faced a problem that couldn't be solved with swords or siege engines: legitimacy. His claim to the throne, while legal, was built on shaky ground. His father had been the younger brother of the previous king, and whispers in the court suggested that stronger bloodlines existed. Whispers that grew louder with each passing year. The solution came in the form of Lady Alara Montclair, daughter of Duke Roderick Montclair, whose lineage traced back to the kingdom's founding fathers. At 16, she possessed not only the bloodline Aldric needed, but also a beauty that had already inspired poets and a spirit that had charmed even the most cynical courtiers. Duke Montclair, drowning in debts from failed harvests and costly military campaigns, saw the marriage as salvation. His daughter's hand would erase his obligations and secure his family's future. For Aldric, it was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. The marriage would silence his critics, strengthen his claim, and provide him with heirs whose legitimacy no one could question. But there was one element neither man had calculated: Alara herself. Unlike most noble daughters of her era, Alara had been educated alongside her brothers. She spoke 4 languages, understood statecraft, and possessed a sharp intellect that her tutors had praised as dangerously keen for a woman. More importantly, she had opinions about her own fate. When the betrothal was announced, Alara did something unprecedented. She requested a private audience with the king to discuss the terms of their union. Not to refuse it, she understood her duty, but to negotiate certain conditions that would allow her to maintain some dignity and autonomy within the marriage. It was a reasonable request from a reasonable young woman. It was also the spark that would ignite Aldric's fury and set the stage for one of history's most brutal displays of royal dominance. Hashtag the gathering storm. The weeks leading up to the wedding revealed the true nature of King Aldric's character. What began as standard marriage negotiations quickly devolved into a psychological campaign designed to break Alara's spirit before she ever set foot in the cathedral. Aldric's first move was to reject every single request Alara had made during their private meeting. She had asked to maintain her own household staff, denied. She had requested permission to continue her studies, forbidden. She had hoped to have some say in the education of their future children, absolutely not. But rejection wasn't enough for Aldric. He began a systematic campaign of humiliation designed to teach his future bride exactly where she stood in his kingdom's hierarchy. He insisted that all communication between them be conducted through intermediaries, treating her as if she were too insignificant to address directly. When Alara's family sent gifts to the royal court as part of the traditional pre-wedding celebrations, Aldrich had them displayed in the servants' quarters rather than the Great Hall. When she requested a specific type of flower for her bridal bouquet, white roses that had been her mother's favorite, he ordered the palace gardens filled with blood-red poppies instead. The dress fittings became exercises in control. Aldrich personally approved every detail of Alara's wedding gown, rejecting design after design until the seamstresses were working around the clock to meet his impossible demands. He chose a style that was beautiful but restrictive, with a train so long it would require 6 attendants to manage and sleeves so tight they would limit her arm movement. Even the wedding ceremony itself became a tool of dominance. Traditional Valdorian weddings included a ritual where the bride and groom exchanged personal vows, speaking from their hearts about their hopes for their union. Aldrich banned this practice, insisting that only the standard religious ceremony be performed. Alara would have no voice, no moment to express her own thoughts or feelings. The guest list was another weapon. Aldrich invited every noble family in the kingdom, ensuring that hundreds of witnesses would be present for whatever he had planned. He also extended invitations to foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, and even rival kings, turning what should have been an intimate celebration into a grand political theater. As the wedding day approached, servants whispered about the king's strange behavior. He spent hours in private meetings with his advisors, planning something beyond the normal festivities. Kitchen staff reported unusual orders for the wedding feast, not just food and wine, but specific arrangements that seemed designed for spectacle rather than celebration. Lady Alara, meanwhile, maintained her dignity despite the mounting pressure. She attended pre-wedding events with grace, smiled at the appropriate moments, and gave no public sign of the turmoil she must have felt. But those closest to her noticed the subtle changes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of powder could hide, the forced quality of her laughter. Her father, Duke Montclair, grew increasingly nervous as the wedding approached. He had expected some degree of royal arrogance, but Aldrich's behavior seemed excessive even by the standards of absolute monarchy. When he attempted to speak with the king about his concerns, he was told that His Majesty was too busy with affairs of state to discuss trivial domestic matters. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock even a court accustomed to royal excess. Aldrich had spent weeks planning not just a wedding, but a demonstration of power that would establish once and for all that in his kingdom, his word was absolute law, even in the most sacred of ceremonies. #The wedding day begins. Dawn broke gray and cold on the morning of the royal wedding, as if the very sky sensed the darkness that would unfold. The cathedral bells of Valdoria rang out across the kingdom, their bronze voices calling citizens to witness what they believed would be a celebration of love and unity. Instead, they would witness something far more sinister. Lady Alara awoke in her chambers at Montclair Manor, surrounded by a flurry of activity as her attendants prepared her for the most important day of her life. The wedding gown, finally completed after weeks of revisions, hung like a white specter in the corner of the room. Its beauty was undeniable, layers of silk and lace that caught the morning light like captured moonbeams, but its restrictive design served as a reminder of the cage she was about to enter. As her ladies-in-waiting helped her into the elaborate dress, Alara caught sight of herself in the mirror. The reflection showed a young woman transformed into a living doll, beautiful but somehow diminished by the grandeur of her costume. The tight sleeves restricted her movement, the heavy train would make walking difficult, and the towering headdress would force her to hold her head in a specific position throughout the ceremony. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, King Aldrich was making his final preparations for what he privately called his masterpiece of instruction. He had spent the early morning hours reviewing his plans with his most trusted advisors, men who had learned never to question their sovereign's methods, no matter how extreme they might seem. The Cathedral of St. Valdric, the kingdom's patron saint, had been transformed into a stage worthy of the drama about to unfold. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls, while tapestries bearing the royal coat of arms hung from every pillar. The altar, normally a place of sacred simplicity, had been decorated with an almost overwhelming display of gold and jewels. But it was the seating arrangement that revealed Aldrich's true intentions. Rather than the traditional configuration where families sat together, the king had ordered the nobles arranged in a specific pattern that would ensure maximum visibility for whatever he had planned. Every seat faced not just the altar, but a raised platform where the wedding feast would later take place. As the morning progressed, guests began arriving at the cathedral. Foreign ambassadors, rival nobles, church officials, and wealthy merchants filled the pews, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. Many had traveled for days to witness this union between two of the kingdom's most powerful bloodlines. Among the guests, rumors circulated about the king's unusual behavior in recent weeks. Some spoke of strange orders given to the palace staff, others mentioned the king's secretive meetings with his advisors. A few of the more perceptive nobles noticed the unusual seating arrangement and the extra guards stationed throughout the cathedral. Duke Montclair arrived with his family retinue, his face a mask of nervous pride. He had invested everything in this marriage, his daughter's happiness, his family's future, his own political survival. As he took his designated seat in the front row, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, though he couldn't identify exactly what. The ceremony itself began with traditional pomp and circumstance. King Aldric, resplendent in royal purple and gold, entered the cathedral to the sound of trumpets and the rustle of hundreds of nobles rising to their feet. He moved with the confident stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed, his cold eyes scanning the crowd as if counting his possessions. When Lady Alara appeared at the cathedral doors, a collective gasp rose from the assembled guests. She was breathtakingly beautiful in her elaborate gown, but there was something fragile about her appearance, like a flower that might wilt under too much scrutiny. Her father escorted her down the long aisle, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The religious ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition. Vows were exchanged, rings were blessed, and the archbishop pronounced them husband and wife before God and the assembled witnesses. To any casual observer, it appeared to be a perfectly normal royal wedding, perhaps even more magnificent than most. But those who knew King Aldric well noticed the subtle signs of anticipation in his demeanor. The way his eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite joy, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth, the way he seemed to be waiting for something beyond the ceremony itself. As the newlyweds processed out of the cathedral, the real drama was yet to begin. The wedding feast, traditionally a celebration of the union, would become something entirely different under Aldric's direction. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the king was ready to deliver his lesson in absolute power. The Feast of Humiliation. The great hall of the royal palace had been transformed into a glittering arena of wealth and power. Long tables groaned under the weight of golden platters, crystal goblets, and delicacies imported from across the known world. Peacocks roasted in their own feathers served as centerpieces, while fountains of wine flowed continuously for the hundreds of guests who filled every available seat. At the head table, elevated on a dais so that every guest could see clearly, sat the royal couple. King Aldric appeared to be in magnificent spirits, laughing loudly at jokes, raising frequent toasts, and playing the part of the jovial bridegroom to perfection. Beside him, Queen Alara, for she was now queen, sat with practiced grace, though those close enough could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she measured each smile. The first courses passed without incident. Nobles feasted on delicacies while musicians played from the gallery above. Toasts were offered to the royal couple's health, happiness, and future heirs. The atmosphere was festive, almost relaxed, as if the strange tensions of recent weeks had finally dissipated. But King Aldric was merely setting the stage for his grand performance. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues throughout the hall, the king rose to address his guests. The hall fell silent, hundreds of faces turning toward the dais in expectation of the traditional royal speech thanking guests for their presence and blessing the marriage. Instead, Aldric began what would become known as the blessing of the crown. "My dear friends and subjects," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall, "tonight we celebrate not just a marriage, but the natural order that keeps our kingdom strong. Tonight, we remember that in Valdoria, there is but one source of authority, one voice that commands absolute obedience." The words seemed innocent enough, but something in the king's tone made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Beside him, Queen Alara's face had gone pale, though she maintained her composure. "Some among you," Aldrich continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, "may have forgotten that even the highest born among us are subject to royal will. Some may have developed opinions about their place in our kingdom's hierarchy." Now the threat was unmistakable. A chill settled over the great hall as nobles began to realize they were witnessing something far beyond a wedding speech. "My beloved bride," Aldrich said, turning to face Alara directly, "has provided us with an excellent opportunity to clarify these matters." What happened next would be recounted in whispered conversations for decades to come. King Aldrich reached into his robes and withdrew a folded parchment. With deliberate slowness, he unfolded it and began to read aloud. It was the private letter Alara had sent to him weeks earlier, outlining her requests for their marriage, her hope to maintain some autonomy, her desire to continue her education, her wish to have input in their children's upbringing. But Aldrich didn't simply read the letter. He performed it, adopting a mocking, high-pitched voice meant to imitate feminine weakness. He paused after each request to offer his own commentary, ridiculing what he called his bride's presumptuous demands and childish fantasies. The hall was frozen in horrified silence. This wasn't just a rejection of his wife's requests, it was a public humiliation designed to destroy her dignity before the entire court. Every word was calculated to reduce the new queen from a person worthy of respect to an object of ridicule. Queen Alara sat motionless throughout the performance, her training in royal deportment the only thing preventing her from fleeing the hall in tears. Her hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. But Aldrich wasn't finished. "Perhaps," he said, folding the letter and setting it aside, "my dear wife needs a more concrete demonstration of her position in this kingdom." He gestured to a servant, who approached carrying a golden chalice filled with wine. The king took the cup and held it out to his bride. "Drink," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of royal decree. Alara, confused but obedient, reached for the chalice. As her fingers touched the gold, Aldrich suddenly released his grip, allowing the cup to fall and shatter on the marble floor. Wine spread like blood across the pristine stones, staining the hem of the queen's wedding gown. "Clumsy," Aldrich observed with mock disappointment. "Perhaps my queen needs practice in the simple art of holding a cup." The insult was devastating in its simplicity. Before hundreds of witnesses, the king had made his bride appear incompetent at the most basic task, then blamed her for his own deliberate action. It was psychological warfare disguised as accident. The great hall remained silent except for the soft drip of wine from the table's edge. Nobles stared at their plates, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Foreign ambassadors sat in shocked disbelief, witnessing a display of royal cruelty that exceeded anything in their own courts. And still, Aldrich continued his systematic destruction of his bride's dignity. Hashtag the breaking point. What followed the wine incident would be remembered as one of the most brutal displays of psychological warfare ever witnessed in a royal court. King Aldrich, having tasted blood in the water, circled his prey with the calculated precision of a predator who knew his victim had nowhere to run. "Stand," he commanded his bride, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Queen Alara rose slowly, wine still dripping from her stained gown, her face a mask of forced composure. The hundreds of guests watched in horrified fascination as their new queen became the unwilling star of her husband's twisted theater. "Turn around," Aldrich ordered. "Let our guests see the full extent of your accident." The command was designed to maximize humiliation. By forcing Alara to display her stained gown to the entire assembly, Aldrich transformed her from a dignified queen into a spectacle of clumsiness and shame. Every eye in the hall followed her movement as she slowly turned, the wine stain spreading across the white silk like a wound. But the king's cruelty had only just begun. "My lords and ladies," he announced, addressing the crowd while his wife stood exposed before them, "I fear my bride requires instruction in the proper behavior expected of a queen. Perhaps you would be so kind as to assist in her education." The request was phrased as a courtesy, but everyone understood it as a command. One by one, Aldrich called upon specific nobles to offer advice to the new queen on various aspects of royal deportment. Each suggestion, no matter how well-intentioned, became another layer of public humiliation. Lord Blackwood was asked to comment on the proper way to hold a wine cup. Lady Ashford was invited to demonstrate the correct posture for a queen at formal dinners. Duke Harrington was requested to explain the importance of grace under pressure. Each lesson reinforced the narrative that Alara was incompetent and in need of constant guidance. The psychological torture was masterful in its design. By involving the court nobles in his wife's humiliation, Aldrich accomplished multiple goals simultaneously. He demonstrated his absolute power over everyone present, he destroyed any possibility of Alara finding allies among the nobility, and he created a shared complicity that would ensure silence about the evening's events. Queen Alara endured it all with a dignity that only made her husband's cruelty more apparent. She thanked each noble for their helpful advice, curtsied at appropriate moments, and maintained a facade of gracious acceptance even as her world crumbled around her. The foreign ambassadors present that night would later write detailed reports to their own courts, describing the scene as unprecedented in its calculated brutality and a display of royal power that exceeded all bounds of civilized behavior. The Venetian ambassador noted that even the most tyrannical rulers of his acquaintance had never subjected their own wives to such public degradation. As the evening wore on, Aldrich's performance became increasingly elaborate. He ordered his wife to personally serve wine to each table of guests, forcing her to walk the length of the great hall while carrying heavy pitchers. When she struggled with the weight, he loudly criticized her weakness. When wine splashed slightly as she poured, he berated her clumsiness. The servants, trained to anticipate their master's needs, had been instructed to provide no assistance to the queen. She was entirely alone in her ordeal, abandoned by protocol and isolated by her husband's design. The breaking point came near midnight, when most of the guests were desperate to escape the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere but dared not leave without royal permission. King Aldrich, perhaps sensing that he had pushed his demonstration to its limits, prepared for his final act of dominance. He called for silence and rose to offer what he announced as a final toast to my beloved bride. The hall held its breath, hoping that the king's cruelty had finally run its course. Instead, Aldrich delivered a speech that would be whispered about in horrified tones for generations to come. He spoke of marriage as a sacred institution of obedience, of wives as vessels for royal will, and of his own divine right to shape and mold his queen according to his desires. The speech was a public declaration that Queen Alara was not a partner in marriage but a possession to be controlled. Every word was chosen to strip away her humanity and reduce her to an object of royal authority. When he finished, Aldrich raised his goblet in a mock toast. "To my queen," he declared, "may she learn quickly and well." The assembled nobles, trapped by protocol and fear, raised their own cups in response. The toast was a collective participation in the queen's humiliation, a moment that bound everyone present in shared complicity. As the evening finally drew to a close and guests were permitted to depart, Queen Alara remained on the dais, still standing where her husband had positioned her hours earlier. The great hall emptied slowly, nobles filing out in uncomfortable silence, leaving behind only the debris of what should have been a celebration. The new queen stood alone among the remnants of her wedding feast, her stained gown a symbol of her shattered dignity, her husband's lesson complete. Hashtag the aftermath and legacy. The morning after the royal wedding dawned gray and silent, as if the very kingdom itself was recovering from the trauma of the previous evening. In the great hall, servants worked quietly to clean away the remnants of the feast, their movements careful and subdued. The wine stains on the marble floor had been scrubbed away, but the memory of what had transpired would prove far more difficult to erase. Queen Alara had not appeared for the traditional morning after breakfast with the remaining wedding guests. Official word from the palace was that Her Majesty was indisposed, a diplomatic way of saying that the new queen was too devastated to face public scrutiny. In reality, she had locked herself in her chambers and refused to see anyone, including her own ladies-in-waiting. The foreign ambassadors who had witnessed the spectacle wasted no time in sending detailed reports to their home courts. Within weeks, news of King Aldric's treatment of his bride had spread across the known world, painting Valdoria as a kingdom ruled by a tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds. Trade negotiations were quietly suspended, marriage alliances were reconsidered, and diplomatic relations cooled noticeably. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the effect on Valdoria's own nobility. The nobles who had been forced to participate in the queen's humiliation found themselves bound together by shared shame and complicity. They had witnessed their king's capacity for cruelty and understood that any one of them could become his next target. Duke Montclair, Elara's father, was perhaps the most devastated by the evening's events. He had sacrificed his daughter's happiness for political advantage, only to discover that he had delivered her into the hands of a monster. Within a month of the wedding, he had withdrawn from court life entirely, retreating to his estates and refusing all royal summons. The king himself seemed energized by his performance. In the days following the wedding, he issued a series of new decrees that further consolidated his power and reduced the autonomy of his nobles. He had demonstrated that even the most sacred institutions, marriage, family, dignity, were subject to his absolute will, and he intended to capitalize on that lesson. Queen Elara's transformation was perhaps the most tragic consequence of all. The spirited, intelligent young woman who had dared to negotiate the terms of her marriage disappeared entirely, replaced by a silent, obedient figure who spoke only when spoken to and never expressed an opinion on any subject. She had learned her husband's lesson all too well. The royal marriage, which should have strengthened the kingdom through unity and alliance, instead became a source of weakness and instability. The queen's family withdrew their support from the crown, other noble families began to question their loyalty, and the kingdom's reputation abroad suffered irreparable damage. Years later, when revolution finally came to Valdoria, many historians would trace its origins to that terrible wedding night. King Aldric's demonstration of absolute power had revealed the true nature of his rule, and his subjects had not forgotten the lesson. The queen he had humiliated became a symbol of resistance, and her suffering inspired others to challenge the tyranny that had destroyed her. The story of that wedding night spread far beyond Valdoria's borders, becoming a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power. It was whispered in the courts of Europe as an example of how tyranny ultimately destroys those who wield it, and it inspired countless works of literature and art that explored the themes of power, dignity, and resistance. In the end, King Aldric's masterpiece of humiliation became his own undoing. The very demonstration of power that was meant to secure his authority instead revealed its fundamental weakness. A ruler who must destroy his own wife's dignity to maintain control has already lost the moral authority to govern. The golden chalice that had fallen that night became a symbol remembered long after the kingdom itself had fallen. It represented not just the queen's humiliation, but the moment when absolute power revealed its true face, and the beginning of its inevitable end. Echoes through history. The tale of King Aldric and Queen Elara's wedding night didn't end with their story. It became a template that would echo through the corridors of power for centuries to come, inspiring both tyrants who sought to emulate Aldric's methods and rebels who drew strength from Elara's suffering. In the immediate aftermath, other European courts began to examine their own practices of royal marriage and public ceremony. The story served as a mirror, forcing rulers to confront the question of where legitimate authority ended and destructive tyranny began. Some monarchs, horrified by Aldric's example, implemented reforms to protect the dignity of royal brides. Others, unfortunately, saw his methods as a useful tool for maintaining control. The psychological techniques Aldric employed, public humiliation, forced complicity, the destruction of dignity, would be studied and refined by future tyrants. The wedding night demonstrated how a skilled manipulator could use ceremony and tradition as weapons, turning celebration into subjugation and witnesses into accomplices. But the story also inspired resistance. Queen Elara's quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming cruelty became a model for others facing similar oppression. Her refusal to completely break, despite her husband's best efforts, showed that the human spirit could endure even the most calculated attempts at destruction. The servants who witnessed the events that night carried the story beyond the palace walls, where it took on a life of its own among the common people. In taverns and marketplaces, the tale grew in the telling, becoming a folk legend about the price of unchecked power and the courage required to resist it. Artists and writers found rich material in the story's themes. Painters depicted the moment of the falling chalice, capturing both the queen's dignity and the king's cruelty in oil and canvas. Poets wrote verses about the wine that stained white silk, using it as a metaphor for innocence destroyed by power. Musicians composed ballads that spread the story across continents, ensuring that the lesson would not be forgotten. The story also became a cautionary tale for future royal marriages. Diplomatic negotiations began to include specific protections for royal brides, and marriage contracts started to explicitly outline the rights and dignities that must be preserved. The horror of Alara's experience led to real reforms that protected countless other women from similar fates. Religious leaders used the story as an example of how power without moral restraint inevitably leads to corruption and downfall. Sermons were preached about the sacred nature of marriage and the responsibility of rulers to protect rather than exploit those under their authority. Even in our modern era, the story continues to resonate. Historians study it as an example of how psychological warfare can be more devastating than physical violence. Psychologists examine the techniques of public humiliation and forced complicity. Political scientists analyze how the abuse of ceremonial power can undermine legitimate authority. The wedding night that was meant to demonstrate absolute power instead became a testament to its limitations. King Aldric's attempt to break his wife's spirit ultimately broke his own kingdom. The humiliation he inflicted rebounded upon him 100-fold, as his cruelty inspired the very resistance that would eventually destroy him. Today, when we visit the ruins of Valdoria's royal palace, we can still see the great hall where these events unfolded. The marble floors have been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but guides still point to the spot where the golden chalice fell. Tourists listen in fascinated horror as they hear the story of the king who thought he could humiliate his way to absolute power. The lesson carved into those ancient stones remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago. True authority comes not from the ability to destroy dignity, but from the wisdom to preserve it. A ruler who must break others to feel powerful has already revealed the weakness at the heart of their reign. And so the story endures, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human cruelty, dignity can survive. Even when power seems absolute, resistance is possible. Even when all seems lost, the human spirit can endure. The golden chalice may have fallen that night, but the truth it revealed continues to shine through the centuries, a beacon of hope for all who face the darkness of unchecked power. And there you have it, one of history's most shocking displays of royal cruelty, where a wedding celebration became a weapon of psychological warfare. The story of King Aldric and Queen Alara reminds us that absolute power, when unchecked by moral restraint, inevitably destroys not just its victims, but those who wield it. What do you think was the most disturbing aspect of this tale? The calculated nature of the humiliation, the complicity of the court, or the way ceremony itself was weaponized? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey into the darker corners of royal history captivated you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Scandalous Pasts for more shocking tales from history's shadows. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the scandals that shaped the world. Remember, the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional tales that may draw inspiration from real historical events and human nature, but they are crafted for entertainment and reflection rather than historical fact. Until next time, keep questioning the stories behind the crowns, and remember, even the most powerful rulers are ultimately judged by history's unforgiving eye.